And now in the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. It was a devastating moment and time. Just devastating. In the late 500s, before the Common Era, the great nation of Babylon absolutely conquered and destroyed the nation of Judah, the nation given to the people of God by God as their land. I cannot imagine how dislocating that must have felt for them. The land that God had promised them, the land that God had assured them, was taken away from them. What a devastating, disorienting reality as the great nation of Babylon absolutely destroyed and flattened Judah. The cost of being conquered was the scattering of God's people. Some sold into slavery around the Mediterranean, some who managed to escape to live in exile in Egypt and Libya, and some who were dragged back to Babylon to live in exile in the nation of those who had conquered them. And who was taken back to Babylon? The cream, the best, the brightest, the ones who had the most power, the ones who had the most influence. Not a bad strategy on the part of Babylon to take back to them, to live with them, those who had held the most power and responsibility in the land of Judah. And in the process, not only were they robbed of their land, but they were robbed of their houses, and the temple was destroyed. Literally, physically destroyed. The temple, the place where they connected with God, where God lived in the very center of it, in the holiest of holies, where they did their daily acts of sacrificial rites that continued to remind them about who they were and whose they were, that they were God's holy people, reenacting the terms of the covenant day after day after day. I cannot imagine how devastating and dislocating it must have been to them to feel that all of God's promises to them have been ripped away, absolutely ripped away. We hear a voice of one who was taken into exile early. We hear the voice of a priest turned prophet, Ezekiel. Ezekiel, the priest who engaged in those daily sacrifices, now turned prophet. We hear the voice of Ezekiel from Mesopotamia when he speaks out and he says, I'm going to tell you why you're in exile. I'm going to tell you why you've lost everything that God promised you. I'm going to tell you why. And the reason you lost everything is because the people who were supposed to be responsible for making sure that we lived out the covenant failed. The people who were responsible to make right choices and decisions failed. Judah was a theocracy, a country ruled by a monarch who was acting as a regent for God. Their sole responsibility as the regent for God was to ensure that they carried on authentic worship and that they engaged in the terms of the covenant that required acts of justice and mercy. And Ezekiel says the ones who had the ability to make right choices and right decisions failed miserably because they became so enmeshed in their own self-interest that they gave up those acts of justice and mercy and authentic worship. And they violated what it meant to be people of responsibility who had the capacity to make right choices and right decisions. And the consequence of not making right choices and right decisions is that right now the people of God are the lost, the least, and the last. They are lost. They have been taken away from everything that they know to live in a land that means nothing to them. They are the least. Once powerful people, they have no power at all, and they are now last because they don't even really technically exist. The cost of not making responsible choices as God's people is that it is easy for God's people to become the lost, the least, and the last. Pretty unnerving time for God's people. And yet, somewhere in the midst of that place of feeling lost comes the voice of the priest-turned-prophet Ezekiel, who says, God will come and find you. God will come and find you and be your shepherd. So the Hebrew word for shepherd means to rule. See the difference? Do you catch the difference between the theocracy gone astray and the shepherd who rules with a sense of perseverance and compassion, with a tenacity that to the ears of the lost, the least, and the last must have sounded so awesome. If you feel lost or least or last and you hear the words of the prophet Ezekiel who says, God has said, I am going to come after you. Wherever you feel lost, least, and last, I'm coming. And I will rule over you with a tenacity of love and care that will bring you back to me. That will bring you back to me. So that you can make responsible, right decisions about what it means to be God's holy people. In Jesus today, we hear echoes of that, do we not? In Jesus today, we hear echoes of Ezekiel when Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, if you wish to be my disciple, if you want to be a sheep in my fold, there are some things I expect of you. There are things that are required of you. And Jesus recounts Judaic, Hebraic acts of mercy and justice. He says, when you feel last, lost, and the least, I expect you to reach out to people like that. I expect you to engage in acts of justice and mercy for the lost, the least, and the last. When you feel hungry, when someone feels hungry, I expect you to feed them. When somebody is dying of thirst, I expect you to give them something to drink. When they are naked, I expect you to give some of your clothing to them. When they are sick, I expect you to go and care for them. When they are a stranger and they feel lost and alone, I expect you to welcome them. And when they are in prison, I expect you to go and just be with them. If you want to be a sheep in my fold, that is what I expect of you. And then he looks at those who have done that, who are kind of actually astonished that he thinks that they did that. That's pretty cool. I'd like that. And then he looks at those who have not done that. Who have not done that. Theocracy or shepherd, who rules? Who rules? Theocracy or shepherds? It's not that those who didn't like people who are sick or strangers or hungry or naked or thirsty, though they're not always probably our favorite folks. It's not that they disliked them. It's that they didn't understand that they were their responsibility. That's what they missed. They missed that the least, the lost, and the last were their responsibility. That's what it means to be part of Christ's flock. That they are our responsibility. Jesus doesn't say every hungry person you personally have to feed. Jesus doesn't say that everyone who is naked you need to clothe. But Jesus says my flock ought to be trying. My flock ought to be trying because my flock ought to understand that the least, the lost, and the last are our responsibility. Our responsibility. So who rules? Who rules in the world that you and I live in? Theocracy or shepherds? Who rules? Most of the time, we behave like we are in theocracies where it's all about self-interest, where it's all about what I need for me and what I need to do to take care of myself. We live in a world where that message is as blatant as it can be, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I hear it everywhere, everywhere. And it ain't going to get any better when we move into this new season, where it's all about what I want, I need, what's right for me. This sense of theocracy that is self-identified and self-focused. That is the world that it looks like to me we live in. It is seductive, it is strong, and it is potent. But when you are the last, the lost, and the least, is that the world you want to live in? No. Is that the world you want to live in? I don't. I want to live in the world where the shepherd rules. I want to live in the world where when I am the lost, the last, and the least, I know that I have a God that Ezekiel promises me, says, I'm coming after you, honey. Excuse me, I'm coming after you, hun. And you will no longer be the last, the least, and the lost because you are the very person that I love the most. Who rules this day? Theocracies or shepherds? I'm not so good on Christ the King Sunday. It's just not in my nature to celebrate monarchies. It's just hard for me to get my head around that image. But that's not really the image that Jesus is talking about. Jesus isn't talking about monarchies. Jesus is talking about the rule of shepherds that reminds us every single time that you have felt the last, or you have felt lost, or you have felt the least. And trust me, there's not a person in the house today who hasn't felt that at one point or time in your life, where you have felt lost and confused and unsure about where you were, where you have felt the least, powerless and vulnerable, where you have felt like the last one in the line. The last one to be picked on the playground. Whenever we feel like we are the last, the lost, or the least, and all of us have, the prophet Ezekiel cries out and says to us, God has said, I'm coming after you, and you will never be the lost, the last, and the least when you are in my flock. Never, never, because I will not let you go. And that is what Christ calls on us to do today. Theocracy or shepherd, who will rule in your life? I can't make that decision for you. I can't make that decision for you, but God can. God can call you to understand that the God who rules in your life is a God of tenacity, of compassion, of power. And because you have experienced that, you now have the grace to be responsible for others who are the lost, the least, and the last. When we are apathetic to those who are the lost, the least, and the last, I believe that is radical sin. But when we understand that those who are our responsibility, it changes how we view them and how we respond to ourselves, to one another, and to those in the community we live in. So the question today is, who will you let rule your life? Theocracy or shepherds? I'm banking its shepherds. Amen.